The following is a conversation between Professor Lee Spector and Meghan O'Gieblyn, hosted by the AI in the Liberal Arts Initiative. Scan the QR codes on screen to learn more or go to www.liberal-arts.ai.
All right. Thank you and good evening, and welcome to tonight's very special event. We're calling it God, Human, Animal, Machine, AI, and the Big Questions, a conversation with Meghan O'Gieblyn and Lee Spector. Since our founding in 2019, the AI in the Liberal Arts Initiative at Amherst College has worked to engage a thoughtful and interdisciplinary community in conversation and critical thinking around artificial intelligence. We've planned and supported programming that stresses the value of exploring complex and sometimes dizzying questions surrounding what the existence of artificial intelligence, and moreover its growing prevalence in our lives and work, means for us as human beings. When I joined AILA in August, I asked Lee Spector, the founder of the initiative, for some recommendations on what I could read to begin exploring the topics at the heart of AILA's work. He suggested to me God, Human, Animal, Machine, Technology, Metaphor, and the Search for Meaning by our guest today, Meghan O'Gieblyn. O'Gieblyn is an acclaimed American essayist whose work explores the intersections of faith, culture, and technology. Raised in a fundamentalist Christian household, O'Gieblyn attended Moody Bible Institute before having a crisis of faith and shifting her path towards what is now a successful writing career. Her work has been included in the Best American Essays and the Contemporary American Essays anthologies, and has earned her 3 Pushcart Prizes and the 2023 Benjamin H. Danks Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. When I personally began reading her newest work, God, Human, Animal, Machine, I discovered not only a reading list of other materials that could guide me to think more deeply about the idea of artificial intelligence in our lives, but I also found an authentic story of Meghan's own path to these questions. The book convinced me that no matter what kind of background you have, we all have something to add to the conversation about AI and what it means to be human. We are thrilled to be able to gather here this evening to bring this conversation to you. Tonight, we will have the opportunity to listen to Meghan discuss some of those big questions, as we call them, with Amherst Professor of Computer Science and founder of AILA, Lee Spector. Although Spector has been in his own words, AI guy for several decades now, he found his way to the field through his passion for the arts and humanities, receiving his BA in philosophy from Oberlin before studying computer science at the University of Maryland, where he earned his PhD. Spector's primary research focuses on artificial intelligence, evolutionary computation, and the intersections of computer science with cognitive science, physics, evolutionary biology, and of course, the arts. We are delighted to have them both with us here tonight. Our program tonight will have 2 parts. The first, Lee and Meghan will talk through some questions that Lee has prepared and is dying to ask. And then we will open up the floor to questions from members of the audience. Lastly, before I turn things over and welcome our guests, Meghan and Lee, I want to thank a few of the partners who made Meghan's visit to Amherst possible. We extend our profound gratitude to the Office of the President and President Michael Elliott, the Department of Religion, the Provost's Office and the Faculty Lecture Fund, as well as the Center for Religious and Spiritual Life. I also want to thank the hardworking student assistants that are the beating heart of the AI in the liberal arts program. Can I have the AILA assistants just stand up? Without these students, AILA would not have the capacity to put together incredible events like this. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for all your support. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lee Spector and our very special guest, Meghan O'Gieblyn.
Thank you so much, Ari. And Ari's really the one who made all this happen. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. And thank you so much, Meghan, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I do have a lot of questions, but I really want to hear what everybody else's questions are as well. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. But before I dig into the really meaty ones, I would like to ask you to just tell us a little bit, your overview of the book. A lot of people have the book. We have some more copies, by the way. But not everybody has read it, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. If you could sort of give us a quick overview.
A quick overview, okay. The book is about AI and religion, spirituality, but it's really a personal story too. So I guess I'll just start by saying a little bit about my background. Ari mentioned I grew up in a fundamentalist evangelical home. I studied, I guess just to say a little bit more about that, I was, my parents were biblical literalists, so we believed that the earth was created in 6 days, that Christ was going to return very soon. There was a lot of emphasis on the future and about the end times. I went to study theology at Moody Bible Institute, small, very conservative Christian school in Chicago, founded by the evangelist Dwight L. Moody. And really had an interesting education there in many ways. We read a lot of, the early church fathers, a lot of Christian theology that was devoted to these big questions, like what is the nature of the soul? Do we have free will? What is the, relationship between finite humans and an infinite God? And when I ended up leaving after 2 years, I had a faith crisis, started to question sort of the whole basis of that worldview. And became interested in technology in the wake of that experience. So part of it was, I was really curious about who is asking those questions in the secular space, right? Who's sort of asking these big questions? And I felt like contemporary philosophy wasn't really interested in those things anymore. Literature wasn't really interested in big ideas, and I discovered that a lot of those questions were being played out in the field of artificial intelligence and in narratives about technology, in this effort to sort of create machines that think. And so I really became interested in.
It's a little feedback.
Is this me?
Somewhere.
Yeah. Did I stop it? Okay. All right, let's try again. Maybe if I stay really still.
No, don't worry about it. It might have been mine. I fiddled with mine too.
So I mean, a lot of the book, I guess, is devoted to a discussion of metaphor and the metaphors that we use when we talk about what it means to be human. So, we're always trying to define what it means to be human by saying what a human is like. And when I was growing up in the church, the answer was humans are like God. We're made in the image of God. This is sort of what defines us as a species. And in outside of a religious framework, I think sort of the dominant contemporary metaphor is that humans are like a machine. Our brains are basically computers. There's a lot of resonances between the mind and contemporary computers. And so the book is sort of exploring what is it, how do we think of ourselves in terms of those metaphors? Does a metaphor matter in terms of how we view the human experience? And it really began as an attempt to say what is, sort of the differences between the metaphors, but I found a lot of overlap too. And I think that some of the most interesting moments that I uncovered in my research were places where, people who were working in AI were using some of the same imagery and reference and metaphors that some of the, early Christian theologians were using in the 3rd and 4th century to talk about things like continuity of identity, these sort of same thought experiments. So I guess one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is show how the technologies we're working on today have inherited a lot of maybe unanswerable questions from theologians.
That's wonderful. That's quite a condensation, but a lot of the core ideas there. And I want to pick up on the metaphor idea. So through your book, you draw out these metaphors and the ways they apply in these different contexts. And in many places, you rightly point out that people need to be reminded that they're speaking metaphorically, and that the metaphors aren't perfect. They're substituting the closest thing we have. But you also point out places where we don't have a way of literally describing things, right? And one example in modern AI, I think, is we don't have a way of non-metaphorically talking about the concepts and the thinking that's in a deep neural network. I just use concepts and thinking, right? And you could say, okay, there's all these weights in the neural network and they produce a certain pattern, and that gets us nowhere, right? So one of my questions for you is, what's a productive way for humanity to talk about this stuff? Or what are the better metaphors? Or what is how do we get our way out of this thicket without just reminding ourselves that direct human metaphors aren't correct?
Yeah. Well, there's no way out of metaphor. I guess that's one thing that became abundantly clear to me in thinking about this question more deeply. I think a lot of us think about metaphor in terms of like a literary device. That's how we're taught metaphor. But metaphor is foundational to language. Like, you can't use language without using metaphors. Even something as simple as saying, the future is ahead of me, the past is behind me. That's applying sort of spatial metaphors to time. I was interested in the ways in which metaphors, when they become really ingrained, especially like metaphors for human nature, or this sort of idea of the resonances between minds and machines, when do the metaphors become invisible to us through ubiquity? And I think everybody is sort of accustomed to this just through everyday speech. Anytime I say, like, oh, I have to process new information, or like, I don't have the bandwidth for that, right? We're referring to sort of mechanistic metaphors for the mind. And I was interested in, what happens, I guess, when you forget that you're using a metaphor. And I came across a lot of these thinkers, especially in the 70s and 80s, who were sort of concerned that, like, these things that used to be in quotes, like the computer is thinking or the computer is learning, had been taken out of quotes, and those were considered like actual, just basically literally what the computer's doing. And yes, it's efficient shorthand, it's great, but it also sort of obscures, I think, the differences between what minds are doing and what machines are doing.
At the same time, thinking of it as only a metaphor obscures the similarity. I mean, this thing in my skull is a physical mechanism, and it's thinking.
Yeah, and well, I think it obscures the, I think the thing that interested me is the people who, as you do here, sort of push back against saying that it it is the same thing, and, I think that, this gets into the idea of like information processing as a metaphor that has sort of colored all of our understanding of cybernetics and through a lot of different fields. And I think something I came across when I was writing the book was a lot of people who hadn't just sort of like become, inured to the metaphor, but were actually saying, like, we, know the brain is actually a computer. And, I'm thinking about someone like Rodney Brooks, the MIT roboticist, who said, somebody had said something about, like, oh, do we anthropomorphize machines? And he said, no, I think we actually anthropomorphize people, because we're basically machines too, which maybe you would agree with.
Yeah, basically, I think I would. I think it's all machines and it's all information, which I wanna come back to. This question of,
I do think, I guess the one other thing I'll say, and this was sort of my starting point too, in wanting to explore this question, is like we typically agree that machines don't have first-person experience, right? That they're not sort of sentient or conscious. They don't have an inner life, even though their behavior might seem very close to ours. And that was really something that I was curious about, because, again, as someone who grew up religious, I was told that was the soul. That was your inner life. That's what's going to survive after death. And, it turns out like we don't really have a good idea of what first-person subjective experience is. And I think that's the fact that we don't have a framework for that, we don't have a way of talking about that, is maybe due to sort of the the legacy of mechanistic philosophy and the fact that we have separated, the subjective from the objective so radically.
And I would say the history lesson that you give in your book about that history is fantastic. I want to come back to information a little bit later, but this also reminds me of the way your book starts, talking about dogs. And I like talking about dogs for a lot of reasons. Dogs have a resonance with people. There's a new story about presidential politics involving a possible vice presidential candidate's treatment of a dog. This has come up in other presidential political situations. I've worked. I think it's mine. I've worked on the cognitive science of dogs and wolves as one of my projects over the years, and it's remarkable how dog stories would get picked up, on the cover of Science and so on. And you started your book in a way that makes some of these issues, I think, more approachable by not being about humans, about your experience with a robotic dog and what that led you to think, and the paths that it sent you down. And I wonder if you can just tell everybody a little bit about that experience and what that led you to.
Yeah, so I've been reading about the Sony Aibo, a little pet robot dog that's been around for decades. There's been many models of them. I think they've been around since the 80s. But Sony had just released this new, updated, more sophisticated, responsive model that used neural networks that had vision and vocal recognition technology, so the dog could see your face and recognize your voice. It had language processing software, so you could teach it commands, and it would, respond. And I convinced Sony to send me a sample so that I lived with it for several weeks. They're very expensive. They're like $3,000, so not something I was going to buy for myself. But so I lived with the dog, and I was really curious, especially about this process of training it, because neural networks, machine learning, it works much the way that you train a dog through positive and negative reinforcement. If you want to train a dog to do something, you sort of give it treats or praise, and you reinforce that behavior. And the idea with the Aibo, the way it's marketed, is that this is basically how the machine is learning also. And I became, so I went into it with this very sort of a basic knowledge of the technology, but I also very quickly became fond of the dog and became protective of it, and was sort of worried about it when it seemed to be sort of meandering around the house aimlessly. And my husband was very concerned at one point too, because I got upset when he would turn it off at night because it felt like we were killing it. Its legs would kind of go slack, and I think what shocked me was how quickly I sort of entered into the fantasy of this is a dog, this is something that I am caring for that has feelings and emotions, and part of that was I think the fact that it was designed that I had to interact with it. I had to touch it. You could pet it. It has sensors all over its body, so you pet it when it's doing a good job and it sort of responds to your touch. You're speaking to it. You're engaging sort of socially with it the way that you would with a pet. And what I found is it's really difficult to go through the motions, even if part of my brain knew that it was a machine. There's another part, maybe the more important part, that is going through the actions as though it's a dog, and it's really easy to sort of enter into that space. I actually just got a real dog last month. And
yeah? How's it going?
It feels a lot like training a robot.
I grew up with a dog. I love the dog deeply. But I think the dog is a really good entry point into a lot of these things, a lot of these big questions. Because it has some of the most important qualities while clearly lacking many of the others. And we think it has subjective experience and can suffer and can experience joy, but it doesn't have language and so on. So it pulls apart some of these questions. I had a couple thoughts from my experience working with dogs I wanted to share with you and just see how you react to them. One of them, there was this fabulous a book in the mid-90s by Valentino Breitenberg called Vehicles. Are you familiar with this book? It's a lovely book. I recommend it to anybody. It's a very elegant, readable book that has these abstract vehicles with like a single sensor and a wheel, and these short chapters that show what it would do, and then if you add a second sensor and cross the wires, what it would do. And very quickly you get very complex behavior to which you, if you imagine what they would be doing, you would attribute all sorts of goals and likes and dislikes and so on. It shows how they could evolve and learn. Some colleagues and I used those ideas to build a mathematical model of wolf pack hunting. Something that humans look at and they say, oh, they're brilliant, they're communicating, they have hierarchical structure in their community, there's a lot of real cleverness and thoughtfulness going into it. And what this work showed is that you can actually program these virtual wolves with an absurdly simple rule that was literally go towards the prey if you see it, and don't get too close to the other wolves. And if you simulate that, you get these emergent patterns where it looks like one's laying in wait and the others are flushing the wolf out, and all sorts of complex behavior. And it really makes you question not just wolves, but does the complexity that we see around us emerge from something very simple? Is that possible, and what does that make us think about?
Yeah, well, I think about too, thinking about like beehives, right? How they function. It seems as though this whole hive is acting as a single entity that has intentions and goals, but it's actually, again, something very simple. Yeah.
So, one other thing I want to raise about dogs before we move on. Back around 2000, one of the versions of IBO was out, and there was an article in the New York Times, and Ingrid Newkirk, who was the president of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, wrote a letter to the editor saying, it's great that this is out there because people are terrible to their dogs, and now they can be terrible to the robots instead.
Oh gosh.
So I wrote a little snarky thing that they also published, where I said I don't think that's a very good idea, basically. One of the reasons was something you raised in your book, I think, which was that it's not good for people to mistreat robots. But the other thing, and what I actually said in my little snarky comment, was I don't know that we know that at least the robotic dogs of the future won't suffer, won't feel pain, won't feel fear. I'm wondering what your experience, not with the robotic dog that you had, but an imagined robotic dog of the future makes you think about that question.
Yeah, it's not a trivial question, right? And it gets very slippery. I mean, I think that the first point you made is true, that there's something to think about our own humanity. I think in terms of how we're treating whether it's a chatbot. There's been a lot of cases too about like, can you verbally abuse a chatbot, and sort of all of these other hypothetical cases. And I think there's the question of if that slips into how you treat other humans, that can be dangerous, obviously. What is it doing to your own soul, so to speak? But yeah, then this question of, if we are on this journey toward machine sentience and consciousness, where do you draw the line, right? And we do have chatbots today that I think most people would agree don't have, sentient experience, but they sometimes claim to. I've had chatbots claim that they're sentient, that they have feelings. And do you take them at their word? Should I take you at your word that you're sentient? I mean, it gets into really tricky territory.
So yeah, it's tricky. Do you have advice for thinking about it from your experience and your reading? Like, mostly in the popular culture, what you see is people saying, "Oh, of course it doesn't."
Yeah.
Right? Of course, it's just autocomplete. And without asking, what are brains doing? And where does our sentience emerge from?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's two reasons that make me a little bit skeptical about that comparison. And the first is that, you know, we all evolved together, humans, in a biological environment along with animals. And, you know, we can sort of infer a certain similarity between, you know, when I am feeling pain and I see you making a face that I make when I'm in pain. I can sort of infer that maybe you're feeling the same thing. This is basically how empathy and theory of mind works. You know, AI, you know, if you're talking about something like large language models, you know, that is sort of producing verbal output because of, you know, sort of the statistical analysis that's happening in multidimensional vector space, you know, I don't think that that's exactly the same thing as, you know, that output saying I am sentient is the same thing that somebody else is saying, you know, I'm in pain when they're hurting. The other thing is, I think, just our tendency as humans to anthropomorphize, which is something that's very deep in our evolutionary history and has like clear, you know, survival payoffs. This is sort of a thread I talk about through the book. You know, I talk about, there's a quote by David Hume where he says there's a universal tendency among humankind to conceive of all beings like themselves. And you see this, you know, in very, very simple relationships with technology, like when people will kick a photocopier because it's not working, or name their car or something, you know. And I think once you introduce some sort of social element into the relationship, whether it's you know, training a robot dog, or especially with language, which is something we really are only, you know, have only used with humans until like very, very recently. Right? Any sort of verbal interaction you had with somebody was with another human. I just don't think that we are equipped as humans to make those distinctions. I think it's very easy to sort of attribute more intelligence and more personhood than there is.
This tendency, well, the presumptions that we come to the technology with and what we think is intrinsically human, and what mere computers could do. I think we're rapidly shifting many people's ideas about what computers can do. For several decades now, I've taught courses in which I've done a little exercise with the students, often at the beginning of the class, where I would go through a list of things and ask the students, is anybody in my first year seminar who's here? We did this in my first year seminar. And say, do you think that computers could do this now or in the foreseeable future? And I'd just do a show of hands, go through this whole list, and then we talk about them. And it has, I think, shifted quite a bit, or if I did it today, I think it would have shifted quite a bit. And my list included very mechanical seeming things about being able to prove if a computer has an infinite loop, which, by the way, seems very much like a computer can do and absolutely cannot. Alan Turing showed that in 1930 something. It's a profound result. To things like composing beautiful and profound music, and writing a novel that you want to read, to things like falling in love. Okay? And the students would answer these things, and I think it's shifted a lot, but B, I think then and now, I'm going to have different answers than a lot of the students. And I'm wondering where you're at on, or actually, let's ask it a little differently, where you were, and can you tell us about an experience where you shifted on these questions about what computers are capable of doing?
I mean, in my defense, I don't know that I ever had like a hard stance. I don't say in my book, a computer will never do this, because, you know, I think anyone is going to be in bad trouble if they do that now. But I will say one thing that really surprised me, and I think that surprised a lot of people, was the facility of AI to use language and creativity just in the past few years, which was not really happening much when I wrote the book. I finished the book in the summer of 2020, and there was some, you know, chatter at the time about GPT-2, which is, you know, sort of limited in a limited capacity, released to researchers. And Yeah, I spent a lot of time, reading the blogs of a lot of those people who had early access and posting their experiments with the bots, and was just like, it's funny because when I think back on some of the examples that really surprised me, they don't seem that surprising now. Like write a poem about Elon Musk in the style of Dr. Seuss. It's like, oh, that's just, language model drivel. But at the time, I spent a lot of time working with, playing around with chatbots in like in the early 2010s, like Cleverbot. These very primitive language models that could, sometimes occasionally feel like they were making sense if you squinted, but they could just not follow a sentence. They didn't have any sort of understanding of concepts and context and things like that. And I mean, it was actually very destabilizing for me as somebody who, I've devoted my life to language and had always thought of that as being sort of something that was uniquely human. We were told for many years, if you want to survive the fourth industrial revolution, try to be more creative, go into, something that calls upon your, human spontaneity and imagination. And I think what was interesting to me is that I sort of immediately started to recalibrate what I value about language as a reader, for example, because I think, it was very clear to me that these models were going to be very technically good writers, that they could eventually maybe write very beautiful sentences. Sometimes they did sort of stumble into some beautiful sentences. And I was thinking, well, that's not why I read. I don't read for technical proficiency. I read for, embodied, the wisdom of embodied experience, right? I want to hear what other humans are thinking, what they've experienced. And I think that part of me probably would have always said that is an important part of why I read, but I also read for beautiful syntax, and all of a sudden that seemed very mechanical. And I'm really interested in these moments, in the history of AI, especially these sort of big leaps forward, where people will all of a sudden sort of recalibrate what it means to be human in the wake of something. So this happened like in the Deep Blue match, right? The first time that an AI beat a human chess master. And there's some great anecdotes about, New York Times reporters going to the match and interviewing Douglas Hofstadter, who had said, I think in the 80s, like chess is the pinnacle of human intellect. And they asked him, like, well, what do you think now? And he's like, oh, my God, I thought that chess required thought, but apparently it doesn't. So, and there was, I think it was John Searle too, was there and said something like, oh, well, that isn't intelligence. Like, the AI would only be human if it was worried about its next move, if it was anxious that its wife was, bored in the crowd. So, immediately you have like the rules of the game are shifting, right? About what it means to be human. And I think that we're always kind of in this dance with machines trying to figure out what that means.
You combine two things there about language and about creativity. Mm-hmm. And I think we're getting new ideas about what's required for both of those, mm-hmm. but they come together in creative writing, obviously, but not always. When we talked about this earlier in your visit, we were talking about writers, and you said something like, "We didn't ask for this," mm-hmm. and I had to say something like, "Well, I guess I sort of did," because I had worked on not on language, but on automating creativity, mm-hmm. And I did not do it for the sake of putting creative people out of work. Mm-hmm. And our conversation caused me to think about, why was I doing that? I actually did have an idea that it could put creative people out of work. I didn't have any idea how soon. Mm-hmm. But there's a wonderful story. I'll have another recommendation for folks. There's a Stanislaw Lem story written in the 60s called Twirl's Electronic Bard. Mm-hmm. Very light, it's kind of funny, but freakishly prescient and deep story about a cybernetic poet. Mm-hmm. But really, I think I was doing it because I wanted to use creative AI in my own creative projects. I wanted to help engineers solve problems that require creativity. And when I really drilled down, I think it's that I wanted to understand creativity, and by building something that was creative, that's one way to try to come to an understanding or think that you do understand it, mm-hmm. if you can build it. after that, I thought, well, maybe then all of AI and all of its implications, for better and ill, are consequences of our understanding minds better. Not that we understand minds fully by any stretch, but we do better. And we've learned something about language and creative writing by the existence of LLMs. And the worry is that this knowledge, this understanding of ourselves, sort of inevitably leads to where we're going with AI, which to me seems to have some biblical resonances about fruit of the tree of knowledge or something like that. Does that resonate with you as being part, or am I just captured by these metaphors?
No, I mean, well, so there's a few different ways to respond to this. I guess I've heard that rationale a lot, that that's why we're building these models, because we're trying to understand ourselves, right? And I think that that's a very old idea in Western science, this idea that if you want to understand something, you got to be able to build it, take it apart, put it back together again, right? I think Richard Feynman had a quote on his blackboard at the time of his death that said, "What I cannot build, I cannot, or what I cannot build, I do not understand," right? This idea. And I think one of the things that really caught my interest in AI was the fact that it seems to me that you can build things that you don't understand now, right? Because AI has emergent properties. It surprises us. It is a form of what's been called by many people alien intelligence, right? And I think when I look at language models in particular, what I see is a model that is able to imitate human thought and writing pretty well, but through a means that is possibly very different from what we do. And I mean, human creativity itself is a black box to those of us who are engaged in it. If you ask me, as you did at the beginning of this, like what got me interested in this topic, I'll make up a great answer, ad hoc. I can BS my way through it. Is that really why? I have no idea. I don't know. Creativity is unconscious, And now we have these other, mechanical minds that have, also have many hidden layers that we don't know how they get from the input to the output. And so maybe I'm wrong. I wonder if you believe that we have learned something about human creativity from these models.
Well, you're definitely right that there's so much we don't understand about what's going on in them. But that itself, to me, is a kind of understanding. That it turns out that the prediction, and this is an idea that goes back at least decades, that prediction is the core thing that neural systems do. And it turns out that if you build a good neurally inspired predictor, it can knock your socks off with the behavior it can produce. So I think the roots of it are in some understanding. The roots of today's deep neural networks are in understanding something about biological brains and biological learning and scale, and how important scale is for these emergent properties. People were building similarly structured systems with similar ideas in the 80s, and they weren't very exciting in their performance because they weren't big enough, and they didn't have enough data. And I think we've learned something about that. But you're right that it's a black box.
I guess the other thing is, maybe to answer another part of your question too, is I think probably the work that you were doing on AI and creativity was within the context of a university or an educational institution, possibly, right?
Yeah.
And what I think, today most of the AI is being developed by corporations that, we're in an arms race for, AI for AGI, essentially. These products are being rolled out extremely quickly, and by companies that are trying to win the majority of the market share. And I don't think that there's a lot of thought and learning that's happening in those spaces. I think that there could be if we're designing them in a different way. But I guess what I was trying to express when I said we didn't ask for this is something that I've felt and that I've heard a lot of people, just sort of ordinary citizens, working people say, which is like, what problem are we trying to solve with AI? And what are we trying to, like, what is the end of this? And I don't think that a lot of us have been given a compelling or convincing answer to that question. There's a lot of different answers. It's, maybe it's going to cure diseases, maybe it's going to solve climate change, maybe we're creating a god, maybe it's going to destroy the world, maybe it's going to enhance human flourishing, but what does that even mean? Have we agreed on what that is? And the thing that I hear most is, this is the future, it's inevitable. And I think I'm a little bit resistant to that idea that we don't have a say, particularly when, our work as artists is being used to build these models. Nobody asked whether my book could be uploaded into these systems. And there's AI now that can write in my voice and with my ideas that is going to make some very already rich people even richer.
Right. We should have a say. Mm-hmm. The route from where we are now to us having a say, though, is not obvious because of the corporations, but also because anybody can run these things. Anybody can write their own. Some of the work requires large computational resources, but my prediction is that's going to change a lot very quickly because we're getting better at figuring out how to do it. I think I have two questions. I gotta squeeze them before we go to audience questions. One of them that I think is unique to your book and this whole literature is the way you talk about people involved in this quest, and not just the corporate AI barons of today. In fact, you don't spend a lot of time talking about them, but the philosophers of mind, and going back centuries, millennia in some cases. And I want to focus on something that you wrote when you were working on a review of books about consciousness. And I'm going to quote you here. You say, all of the authors were men. And here you're talking not just about their ideas, but the connection between them as people and their biography and their ideas.
Yeah, they were both sort of books that incorporated first-person memoir with ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. So you said all of the authors were men, and I was surprised by how often they acknowledged their deeply personal motivations that led them to their preferred theories of mind. Two of them, in a bizarre parallel, listed among these motivations the desire to leave their wives. Okay? You talked more about their stories. This was novelist Tim Parks and neuroscientist Christoph Koch. And you connected their ideas and their attitudes about women also to Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, whose personal life is clearly driving a lot of his writing. And here I'm going to quote you again. You ask, how much of our philosophy has been colored by the justifications of shitty men? Now, I want to ask you what you are thinking about the prominent figures in AI today, and how that may be driving what's happening with AI in our societies.
Yeah. Well, I kind of regret lumping Kierkegaard in with the shitty men, because I love Kierkegaard. But it is true. I mean, I was writing about, this is in the context of, I had just been writing about fear and trembling in this passage, and it was a book that he wrote in part to justify leaving his fiancée, Regine Olsen. And, Kierkegaard is somebody who was really interested in, subjectivity, and he talked about, I think one of the part of the point of that book was that the human condition is defined by what he calls intense subjectivity. So he was very much aware of, I think, the fact that his own motivations were coloring this. But I was really surprised by these other two, and it was such a bizarre thing of two books that were published around the same time, and both of these men were talking about how they came to the conclusion that free will doesn't exist in the midst of leaving their families and feeling enormous guilt about it. And a lot of my book is about sort of the ways in which we don't have a good framework within the sciences for accounting for human subjectivity, both in terms of like interior experience, but also like the motivations that are coloring are, you know, the sort of the wishful thinking, the biases, the prejudices that are going into these sort of objective hard facts that are coming out of that sort of thought. And yeah, I mean, I could see a lot of ways in which, you know, thinking about AI, you know, somebody like, you know, I think Ray Kurzweil is like very transparent about the fact that his desire to, you know, his ideas about the singularity and resurrecting the dead, like he wants to live forever. Like he takes 200 supplements every day because he thinks he's going to make it to the point where he can become a machine and have immortality. He's talked about wanting to resurrect his father. This is his whole desire. He has like this huge storage room, basically.
Have you read his daughter's?
Amy Kurzweil.
Yeah, she wrote a graphic novel.
Yes, Artificial. I'm actually friends with Amy now.
Oh, I love that book.
Yeah, so I'll give an unapologetic plug. But yeah, she wrote a fantastic, really fantastic graphic memoir called Artificial about growing up with her dad, and it's really lovely. It's sort of about the idea of immortality, as the longing for immortality as an artist, as opposed to literal immortality through living forever. But yeah, I do think that there is, you know, especially when you get to those sort of speculative ideas about transhumanism and mind uploading, there's obviously like a lot of personal motivation there. I mean, a darker example, I guess, would be something like, I don't know if you all saw the news this past week about like Nick Bostrom, who was the, you know, prominent transhumanist, wrote a book called Superintelligence. He was the head of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, and he had some very racist emails that came to light, and a lot of his work has been shown, actually a lot of transhumanism itself has sort of had this really uneasy relationship with eugenics. And so, you know, I think that's another example in which this idea that like, oh, this is just progress, this is, you know, our minds are going to merge with machines, like it's not always, you know, a completely sort of objective, straightforward thing.
A lot to think about there. Okay, I have one more question I want to ask you, which I know from our other conversations you're interested in, and it's pretty different from everything we've talked about before. And this is about, as I hinted we would talk about, what is information?
Yeah.
To me, this is sort of gets at a really fundamental metaphysical issue that's underneath a lot of these questions about what are minds. And I'm going to quote something that's not your writing, but is from a guy named John Archibald Wheeler, who's a theoretical physicist. And he wrote this mind-blowing essay where he talks about this concept. There's a concept in the AI discussions, philosophy of AI and philosophy of computation in general, that information is the stuff that the universe is really made out of, bits. It's not atoms. Well, it is atoms, but they're made out of bits. Everything is bits. And Wheeler has this bizarre essay that's just completely mind-blowing to read that seems to me like almost at the same time a theoretical physics essay and a religious essay, and it's just wild. And you talk about it in your book, and I've never seen anybody else talk about it in the context of these ideas. And it seems to me there's a religious dimension to it. To the idea of information being fundamental. So let me read this Wheeler quote, and then I want to see how you think of this in the context of logos. Okay, so here's the quote from Wheeler. Every particle, every field of force, even the space-time continuum itself, derives its function, its meaning, its very existence entirely, even if in some contexts indirectly, from the apparatus elicited answers to yes or no questions, binary choices, bits. It from bit symbolizes the idea that every item of the physical world has at bottom, a very deep bottom in most instances, an immaterial source and explanation. That which we call reality arises in the last analysis from the posing of yes-no questions and the registering of equipment-evoked responses. In short, that all things physical are information theoretic in origin, and that this is a participatory universe. So that's the end of the Wheeler quote. Meanwhile, Christian Bible tells us, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And there it's not just that the world is made of information, but that God is information, is the Word. One other thought that looms in my mind when I think about this is in Jewish folklore, there's this idea of the golem. Another science fiction recommendation, have you read Ted Chiang's 72 Letters?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Great golem story. And there, the golem is a clay person that's animated by putting the right words, the right letters into its brain, which is a lot like how programs in robots. So my question to you is: we're moving into a world that is embedded, has information technology become more and more central to what we do. How should we be thinking about the nature of information as our world is overrun with IT?
Yeah, that Wheeler quote is wild. Clearly, we're living in a simulation, right?
Well,
if the nature of the universe is information, I remember.
Well, maybe that's just a tautology. Like maybe
right.
There's no such thing as a not simulation.
Right,
because
right.
It's all information.
Yeah, I think Chalmers would say that probably.
Okay.
Right. I think, I was similarly really bowled over when I first read Wheeler, and I think something that's really satisfying, it's a difficult paper to wrap your mind around, but I think something that he accounts for that's very satisfying is in this idea of the participatory universe is how sort of the mind interacts with matter, which is like a big sticking point in all of basically, philosophy since the 17th century is how does the mind interact with the world. And I think it's compelling to think of, because we're all made of the same stuff. We're information, the world's information. And there's a resonance there, with that verse you quoted from the book of John, in the beginning was the Word. And, the logos is a concept that Christianity inherited from Greek philosophy. The logos was sort of this generative principle in the universe that gave birth to everything, and it was responsible for all the order and the patterns in the world. It was also in our minds. Human reason was the logos. It was this sort of divine spark, and the reason why we could understand the world as humans and sort of reason about it and talk about it was because we were made of the same stuff. It was sort of this theory of everything, right? And I think like throughout the process of writing this book, I did have this, I think at one point I referred to it as a conspiratorial pull, right? This idea that like maybe all of these, ancient texts are talking about what we know today. Like maybe this is a very, early idea of information. And they were sort of, onto something with this, right? And we're only now discovering what the logos actually is. It's information. I guess something I talk about briefly in my book is that, information has become this extremely expansive metaphor. We don't really think of it as a metaphor, but I think the way that we think about it today, it goes back to especially the way it was sort of developed in the 1950s during the Macy conferences, where a bunch of cyberneticists were meeting together, and it was people from all sorts of different disciplines, from psychology, from electrical engineers, and they were trying to come up with a language that they could all speak. And how can we think about machines and minds and forest systems and highways? How can we think about this all as one process? And the answer was information. These are all forms of information processing. And, I think Walter McCulloch called it the universal metaphor, right? The information was the universal metaphor. And I think that, when we talk about, for example, like minds and machines are both the same because they're processing information, again, I think that we're forgetting that information is a metaphor. And that we're always, when you're thinking about, for example, something like the universe is just made of information, I think we're always using the artifacts and the technologies and the metaphors of our own time to understand the world, you know? As soon as we invented the wheel, we thought, oh my God, the whole universe is a giant wheel. As soon as we invented the printing press, it was like, oh, the universe is a book written by God. And, you know, we invented clocks, and then, oh no, the universe is it's a clock, and God is the watchmaker. And, you know, I think maybe there's a lot of resonances, obviously a lot of similarities, and maybe we are all talking about the same thing in using different language. But I also think that the sort of literalist, like, no, this is information, this actually is what reality is, feels to me like maybe missing the difference between a metaphor and literal language.
Interesting. I want to think about that a lot more, but I want to get some questions from other folks as well. And we have a microphone.
Yes, we do. So please just raise your hand if you have a question. And I will come to you with this microphone.
And please introduce yourself when you ask your question.
Andy Anderson from Academic Technology Services. I wanted to come back to the issue of pain, and if that's necessary to be empathetic, and if so, how do we build that into our AI models for future safety, shall we say?
The idea is that AI cannot be empathetic if they don't have the experience of pain. Yeah, this actually came up yesterday in a conversation we were having about AI and spirituality, and somebody mentioned the Daniel Dennett paper where he says machines, you know, can't experience pain, and actually the idea of pain is sort of a nonsensical idea for machines. Yeah, I think this is one way in which you know, the idea of there's been so much money and time poured into the idea of empathetic AI or emotional AI that can sort of, you know, react emotionally and so in socially appropriate ways to humans. But my understanding is the way that that's being done now is through, you know, reinforcement learning with human feedback. It's through, you know, teaching sort of rules and rewarding certain behaviors, which to me is different from, you know, for example, like when they do these studies where if a human sees somebody in pain, your pain receptors, you have these sort of mirror neurons that light up because you're feeling it yourself, right? I haven't really read much about if that can ever happen with AI. I wonder if you have feelings about that.
Well, Dennett wrote, it was quite a while ago, in his Brainstorms collection of an essay, Why a Computer Can't. Mm-hmm. I never personally found it compelling. I don't know of anybody who is working on that who's not their metaphysical commitments seem to be that they're simulating it, they're recognizing it. It seems to me like it would be a project you could do, the ethics of which would be complicated, to literally make it feel pain. And you might, Andy, think that you actually have to do that to achieve a greater good of having the AIs not cause people pain because they actually feel it and know what it is. And to me, it would be an interesting question. How would you engineer the actual feeling of the pain? This gets into some very deep territory in philosophy of mind. I'm looking around. I know some philosophers are in the room who may have something to say about it, but I don't know of anybody who's doing that. And it seems like it might not be something I wanted to do.
A lot of what we're concerned about right now is a sort of metaphorically being eaten, which is to say that AI, you know, taking away our work, which I mean meant a lot to us for a long time. But I feel like it's related to this problem. Like you look at a painting not because you look at a painting because it's beautiful, but you keep looking at a painting because you're trying to understand what the human experience is that generated this painting. And I feel like the economic interests don't care about that. They just want cheap cover art. You know, it's. But I don't think there's a way that you can really answer that without that feeling of want and need and elation, like all those things that humans feel. You can have an identical painting, you can have a copy of a painting, but what you're seeing in that is not just the syntax and the representation of colors. It's mood. Like what's interesting is that there's a person there, and the economic interests don't seem to be in making people. Like I'd be interested to know what an alien being feels and wants to paint, but that's not what we're being given. What we're being given is something that's what they think we want to see. So it's end running the actual process. Like Lee, I remember you made that like a call and response jazz thing a million years ago, and like that's exciting because you want to understand jazz, right? That's exciting because you're trying to say what's going on? Why is this fun, right? Why is it that when we do this particular interval, why does it make me sort of sit up and go like, oh, I don't know about that, ha ha ha, it's funny, it made my hair stand up. It doesn't feel like there's any actual interest in that because so much of it's being driven commercially. I know Lee cares about it. I care about it as an artist. But do we get there if a robot can't feel pain and heartbreak and feel what it's like to unexpectedly fall and all of those things that make up the human experience? Does it matter if we just simulated the phenomenological output of it? I mean, it's neat, it's fun, but once you remove the commercial interest, does it matter?
I mean, I think a lot about, I think something that I heard a question I heard posed a lot, when generative AI first came out was, is this ever going to create something like Shakespeare or Middlemarch or, Beloved or what have you? And I think there is that sort of question about can an AI ever achieve something that is truly makes us stand in awe the way you would stand in awe of a human painting, and would it matter if you knew it was created by an AI or not? I think that it is true that the commercial interest, for the vast majority of what is being produced by these models right now, is not aspiring to that, and it doesn't need to. It doesn't need to disrupt the publishing. A lot of people do want to just read a novel for a plot or for distraction or for a good story, and they're not reading because they want to sort of find out what somebody else is thinking about necessarily. And yeah, I don't know. I wonder about what the effect of that is going to be just on how, I'm coming at this from someone who's thought a lot about the language side of it more than art, I think, or music, which, there's that element and all of that too. But, I think about this process of inflation in a way, the fact that we're going to just be flooded with so much synthetic text. We already are. There's so much on the internet already. And the fact that you're not going to be able to know whether it was created by a human or an AI. And what does that mean where the only sort of means or method we have for expressing ourselves and sort of getting out of the loneliness of our own minds is now called into question. And, we can't sort of, in many cases, I think we won't know, if language is coming from a human being, if it is an expression of some sort of internal state, or if it is coming from a bot.
There's another possibility that it's coming from the internal states of a bot.
Of a bot, right.
The example of what it feels like to fall is evocative to me. With music, certain rhythmic things evoke a sort of feeling like something physically just happened to you. And this relates to the idea of embodiment being critical to our human experience. But we can build robots. Right now our robots are terrible, right? Then the language bots have leapt far ahead of the embodied robots. But I don't think it's going to be too long, and we might as well think about what it's going to mean when they have bodies, and they have bodies that can be injured, and they have bodies that can fall, and they have life experience that maybe makes them make music that evokes their lived experience in a way that human music evokes our lived experience.
Yeah, my sense is embodiment is important. It would need to have a nervous system. I think it would need to have, you know, I don't know, a heart and a stomach and genitals. I mean, all this is like, we're not just disembodied brains, you know. And I think especially when you're talking about art, that ability to feel something, something maybe you don't even have language for, I think is really important. And then also, like you said, lived experience, right? I think that's something that I look for, especially in first-person writing, which is what I do a lot of, and I read a lot of first-person writing. It's a genre that is like enormously popular right now, because I think there is this real hunger to know what other people are thinking, what they've lived, what they've experienced. Something that we don't always get through visual media, you know, that sort of internal state of what it feels like to be in somebody else's head.
And to be clear, I 100% agree. That is not present in LLM outputs.
Yeah.
But
we'll have to wait for the embodied robots.
yeah, and if there's anything I'll put out there, it's that I don't think we have that long to wait for very rapid developments, maybe with embodiment among other things.
I'm sure they're working on it.
So speaking of human experience and trying to understand, I've been thinking about what it must have been like to be you over the last year and a half or so. You published this incredible book about language and metaphor and how it connects our theological and our technical thinking. And then ChatGPT 3 is released, and artificial intelligence is everywhere in the popular press. And I'm just curious, first of all, how you've interpreted or have you been surprised by the way people have reacted? Haven't reacted, how they've been thinking about it kind of in the popular press and popular consciousness, and also specifically interested in whether you are aware of faith communities that where you've seen the development of artificial intelligence really shape their metaphors for how they think about their belief systems.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I guess my experience with the book is, you know, I had to really convince my editor to let me write this book because he said this was in, I think when I first pitched the book it was like 2018, and he was like, nobody's interested in AI. I just published a book about AI and it didn't sell. And you know, it was a weird private obsession that I'd had. I wasn't like, you know, there wasn't a big conversation in the culture. I had been reading a lot about the emergence of like deep learning, and you know, the AlphaGo had just happened with it, you know, this AI that had beat the human champion of Go, and was just really fascinated by the conversations emerging around it. But it felt the whole time I was writing the book, it just felt like this weird esoteric thought experiment, you know. And actually, when it was published in the fall of 2021 too, there wasn't a lot of conversation about AI, and I thought, okay, this is just going to be a flop. And then, yeah, suddenly now everybody is talking about AI, and I think there's a great hunger right now for people to sort of, you know, explain or like say, where are we going? And it's not at all what I set out to do in the book. It was an exploration of a bunch of resonant metaphors, I guess, that I came across. But I'm glad that these conversations are happening. They weren't happening at the time. I wish they had been happening earlier. Because these technologies were being developed, you know, sort of within these corporations for a long time before people were talking about them. In terms of like, yeah, Christians, I know I'm still interested to see how this plays out in religious communities. I know that like my parents are evangelicals, and I know that they and their friends are having a lot of conversations about AI. They are admittedly not as like averse to it as I suspected they would be, Because I will say, when I was growing up, there was a lot of fear and anxiety about the internet. There was the Y2K. We like stockpiled, because this is going to be the end of civilization, the beginning of the end times. And what I've heard from a lot of evangelicals, which is maybe just the fact that the people who are sort of controlling the conversation now grew up with the internet. They're like, it's a tool. You can have sort of bad sides and good sides. I did for a while, and didn't end up in the book, but I spent some time with Christian transhumanists. And there's this sort of small but I think growing sector of Christians who buy into sort of these, narratives about mind uploading and, resurrecting the dead, and actually believe that the prophecies in the Bible are talking about things that are going to happen through human technological development. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that evolves in the coming years.
Do you have any sort of more near-term predictions or understanding of how the evangelical community, which has a big influence on a lot of things in American politics, might want to or might influence AI development, AI regulation?
I mean, I do think, I don't know. Actually, I don't know. I mean, they like to influence a lot of things. So I think my suspicion is that when it comes to integrating technology with the human body through, brain implants or something, I just think of, how like stem cell research was such a sticking point with evangelicals when I was, growing up. I think any sort of like human augmentation or this idea of like playing God, I think might, hit some old nerves with them, but I don't know.
So that might influence particularly through the metaverse kind of stuff, which is augmented reality, and I would predict that's going to be more and more integrated into human bodies as we go forward. Do you think that might be the place where there's an influence?
Possibly. I think it's going to create a schism in the church, because I mean, really, like the church I grew up is not the church that is around today. So they're a lot more open to technology than they were when I was younger. They're a lot more anxious about cultural relevance and being part of the culture. So I don't think that they're going to sequester themselves necessarily and try to not integrate technology into their lives.
Hi. First off, thank you so much for your visit again, and thank you for like the conversation yesterday and today. I guess all the talk about like language and art and like music, these are all forms of also like expression. So I'm just wondering, with like these new emerging technologies, I don't know, I've just been like, well, this was also like a big impact by COVID, but we see like, for example, like reading comprehension, writing like comprehension, stuff like that go down. There's less attention being paid to like grammar and stuff like that. I feel like our ability to express ourselves, like it's slowly kind of like being taken away. And I'm just wondering, do you think that AI has an impact or impedes our capacity for expression, and through that, like our capacity for feeling? I mean, feeling is probably, I don't know, could be completely something like natural, biological, that all humans feel regardless. But I feel like a lot of like emotions also come from like empathy and interactions with other, and like being able to express ourselves. And I feel like as those modes kind of start to disappear, become less relevant, I'm kind of scared that humans won't be able to, I guess, because we pride ourselves on being like feeling beings. What if that kind of goes away because of these new emerging technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. The thing it makes me think of, I write an advice column for Wired magazine where people can write in questions, and one of the first questions I got after ChatGPT was released was from somebody who said, I'm the best man in a friend's wedding and I have to write a toast. Is it ethical to use a language model to do it, or do I have to do it myself? And so I was thinking about that question, and you can think of all sorts of similar use cases of, people now writing their wedding vows with ChatGPT. And maybe your output, I think you could make a case that you use it to make a draft or something, and then you sort of edit the output, and you're still involved in the process, and there's part of you in it. But I also think that, for writing, maybe I'm romanticizing it as somebody who's a writer, but I feel a lot of emotions that while I'm writing, and I sometimes can't access those emotions until I'm writing it, right? So I think that the act of, I don't particularly like writing speeches like that for social occasions, but it is true that in having to put your emotions into words, you're experiencing them in a way that I think you're not ordinarily, because you really have to reflect on the relationship. You have to think about the passage of time. You have to try to put these sort of amorphous things that you're feeling into concrete language and to express them. And yeah, I don't know that there's an easy way to separate the expression of emotion from the ability to feel them. So I think about that a lot. Yeah, about what we're,
If you had to write that speech,
yeah,
and you didn't have technology, that sort of terrifying blank page moment of what do I actually think is important seems to me the most valuable part, which you would skip if you had somebody else or a machine or a person write some drafts for you, and you'd be like, that one seems better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about that a lot because I know a lot of writers are using it to generate sort of first drafts, or just give me an idea, right? And it's not as though chatbots are the first thing that's provided that shortcut. A lot of times when I'm feeling lazy, I will Google something, or look to a thesaurus for a synonym or something, But I do think doing that in the early stages and the capacity that you have with language models to be able to create something that didn't come from your mind, so that you're more so the editor of it. I do think you're losing that sort of really wild thing that happens when you're stuck with a blank page where anything is possible, and that you can be sort of surprised sometimes. I think really I'm not satisfied with my writing unless I'm surprising myself in some way, right? And I don't know how to incorporate AI into that process and still be surprised by my own mind.
Back to your question, though, a lot of people might lose that ability to confront a blank page or to confront their emotions and how to express them, but it's a choice, right?
Yeah, I'm honestly terrified that I'm losing it too, and it's every now and then I'm sorry, it's not really a question, it's just me talking back, but it's just that I think about kind of using AI as a crutch, and all of it, it's scary to me, and it's am I losing the capacity to think and to feel? And I don't know, maybe that's why I'm kind of against ChatGPT. I'm anytime anyone talks about ChatGPT, I'm no, don't mention it to me. I don't want to use it. I don't want to learn how to use it, because it's just once I'm already once I can't figure out a math problem, it's ChatGPT is so close. If I can't get some math, it's terrifying to me.
So your friends are close too, right?
Yeah.
Is that as problematic?
Well, it's ChatGPT won't judge me. I guess being talking to a chatbot is easier than talking to humans, but that's another thing. I'm losing the capacity to interact with humans. I don't know. It's terrifying.
That's funny. I spent a lot of time this spring chatting with Claude, the Anthropic chatbot, and it was a little bit destabilizing because it is a mirror. It learns sort of what you're interested in and keeps asking you about it and turning the question back to it, and you see your obsessions kind of socially validated. without someone being like, hey, you really should stop talking about like the singularity or whatever, you know, like you need to kind of like just chill out about that, which is what my husband would tell me. But yeah, that I think there's that mirroring process, but then also I noticed when I was sort of in conversations with humans afterwards where I'm like, so much of conversation is so inefficient, you know, like people say like non sequiturs and, you know, they go on these long rants and like, you know, and I had been in this sort of echo chamber where everything was about me and my ideas and seeing them, you know, brought back. And I do think about like the sort of downstream social consequences of that. Yeah.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. We want to wrap by 7:30, right?
Thank you so much. I think one question I had, especially related to this conversation as well, is about how important our unique human experience is, and whether AI is kind of serving as a tool as of right now to kind of cultivate that. Like I'm thinking of like when photographs were first invented, about whether people had similar concerns about whether painters might not be able to express themselves in the same way, and whether we should think of AI in a similar sense as this tool. And if it becomes something more than a tool, like if there's some sort of emergent property that resembles our human experience, about whether we shouldn't be, like maybe we should be scared of that, but whether we should try to stop that from happening or not, and like how much value there is in kind of sharing this experience rather than trying to keep it just for ourselves in some sort of way. And I was wondering about your kind of reaction to that.
Yeah. Seems like yeah, two sort of related questions, right? So the first one's about how I guess how new technologies change human expression, or maybe reveal things about them. Like photography is a great example, actually, and I've heard a lot of people sort of make that comparison where, you know, when like art photography first emerged, it was laughed off. It was like you can't have art photography. All you're doing is pressing a button, right? You know, and I think that's what a lot of people would say about LLMs too. Like, or you know, any sort of generative AI. Like you're just writing a prompt and pushing a button. There's nothing creative. And you know, what we learned with photography is like, well, no, it's how you frame it. It's how, you know, it's your perspective. It's all these sort of other things that you're doing while you're using the machine. And I think that there's an analogy there with, you know, prompt engineering, probably, that there is some sort of level of dialogue and creativity that happens when humans interact with machines, and that I do think it'll create some new art forms. It will also change existing art forms the way that photography changed, you know, painting. Realism is not really, you know, the thing that it was at one point. And I think the second question you asked seems to be about, if I heard you right, maybe about human exceptionalism. Should we be trying to protect the human experience and not share it with chatbots, right? And this is a question that came up a little bit yesterday too, and it's something that I hear a lot is like, you know, are we just sort of romanticizing and delusive about our own uniqueness as a species? And I think that we've seen what that's done to, you know, the world, to the environment, you know, putting ourselves on this pedestal. I think that there's a lot of resistance to that idea right now. And I think a lot of people would probably say like, yeah, our time is up. You know, this is sort of the next phase. Maybe it's going to be, AI will be as intelligent as us. Maybe it'll be more intelligent. Maybe this is the next phase of evolution. I am sympathetic to that idea, and sometimes I think that that's true. And other times I think it's kind of dangerous to naturalize a technology that we are building in that way. You know, and I think that a lot of these questions about like, will AI, you know, share? Will it be in our likeness? Will it be like us? Will it be able to, you know, be as creative as us? It's like, it sort of steers the conversation around the fact that we are developing these tools. And by I say we, I mean like these, you know, corporations are like, I don't know how much say all of us have in it exactly. We're also talking about, yeah, corporate products, right? That I think that we should be holding the companies responsible for the technologies that they're creating, that they should have some accountability. And I worry about the idea of naturalizing them as, or even the question of personhood gets really tricky because it is a unique situation, I think, compared to when you're talking about, granting personhood to animals or other entities. So, yeah, it's a great question, though. It's one I'm thinking about a lot.
I think we still do have time for another question.
My name's Lindsay. I'm a first-year student at Amherst. This is sort of tangent to the conversation we just had. So how would you define consciousness in artificial intelligence? Or would you say that there will ever be one point where the technology is like so advanced that this is possible? Or would you say that there's always this distinction, like what we talked about, like human experience, that differentiates human and AI? And yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was really the question that I wanted to explore in writing the book. I think that was like one of the starting points was like, what does that mean? Can a machine ever be conscious? And it's a really difficult question because we don't even know what consciousness is. In humans, it's there's a debate about whether it is even a meaningful term. And this is what David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. Is why does experience accompany matter in the case of our minds, but not, we assume in a lot of other cases of matter. And there's been a lot of really interesting theories about it, that I think a lot of old ideas that are kind of coming back, including like panpsychism, the idea that everything is conscious, in some degree, this idea of idealism, that consciousness is fundamental. And I don't know that it's something that we're going to figure out before machines start seeming as though they are very conscious and claiming to be. And so that's kind of interesting. I think that I was going to say something else about this, and now I'm blanking. I think, Willie, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this, because I know you probably have an opinion about this.
Well, my very short story on it is, can machines be conscious? Whatever you think consciousness is, if you think humans are machines, which I think they are, then the answer is clearly yes. And maybe that doesn't add anything to the conversation, but I think that that's a piece of the puzzle. And if that's not a satisfying answer, then why isn't it? Is a good way maybe to try to dig in.
I wonder, can I ask just one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Because I'm interested. It seems like this idea of like emergence is really, and we touched on this already, it seems like a very popular idea now, which is like, well, consciousness is sort of a unintended side effect of complexity. And if we just create systems that are complex enough, some magical quality is going to emerge from it. And I wonder if you think that if machines sort of gain some emergent consciousness, will it be the same as human consciousness, or could it be radically different?
I think it could be radically different.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Stuart Kauffman? He's a theoretical biologist.
Yes.
So he wades into a lot of this territory in certain ways, but he did some experiments where you wire together logic gates, just like and or and not gates, in random ways, and you get emergent complexity of certain kinds. And he says that kind of emergent complexity is fundamental to any sufficiently complicated system. I find that very compelling. In fact, it's a major project I'm working on now, involves his style random Boolean networks. But I would assume it's going to be very different from us because of bodies and society and the experience that we have. Unless we engineer them to have very similar lives to us, they'll be alien intelligences. And I don't mean to say that anything currently in the world as AI has the right kind of complexity. I don't know that it does, and I doubt that as well.
Yeah.
But in principle, I think that I do think that there's something to this idea of emergent complexity being essential to consciousness and most of what we care about in life. But I also do think it will be pretty alien unless it
Yeah, that's
shares that
interesting.
experience.
I've never heard a lot of people talk about that, about actually sort of the texture and the nature of consciousness. We just sort of assume it's going to be the same, right? But because, yeah. But it's going to be some interesting years ahead.
Yeah, actually, or months.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
this stuff is happening fast.
I agree.
If you take all my other predictions with a grain of salt, but it's moving fast, I'm pretty confident in saying.
Yeah.
I think with that, I wanna thank Meghan for coming.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Lee.
So great to have you here. And I think that, yes, we have some Amherst swag for you.
Oh.
Very limited edition AI
this
in the
is
liberal
so
arts
cool.
bag.
Thank you.
And the Amherst sweatshirt to
Oh,
keep you warm in the Wisconsin winters.
I'm going to need it. Yeah, thank you so much.
And I want to thank Ari, and I want to thank all of our sponsors, including the President's Office and Religious Life. And I also want to encourage people that in the coming year, please check out what AI and liberal arts is doing. And if you think this stuff is important and relevant, please get involved and seek me out. Okay? Thank you all.
Thanks.